Andrew MacKenzie, art historian. Here we are again, 2 days away from Anzac Day in the Vic Arts Society. The Society had a lot to do with the First World War. Andrew, can you tell us how all of the artists linked in and what they did?
Yes, whether at home or abroad, the members of the Victorian Artists'Society had made major contributions to the First World War effort. During the First World War, they were involved with 4 of the major publications that were produced, including the Anzac book, which Frank Crozier, who was a member of the 22nd Battalion over in Gallipoli, he illustrated both the front cover and illustrations within that book. The second publication was Nellie's gift book, Nellie Melba's gift book, and she had plenty of contributors from the Victorian Artists'Society for that, since her conservatorium was, of course, here in this room, so that was no problem for Nellie. The third book was the Australia at War book by Will Dyson. Again, this was a major contribution to the war effort, showing the artists, showing the Anzacs at the Somme, and producing the large publication that he did. And the fourth one people forget about was the Art of Frederick Mccubbin. And this was basically because it was a book which they could show his major contribution as far as nationalism in Australia at that time.
But Will Dyson became eventually the first official war artist and had a very significant role in the development, I gather, of the images that people saw back home.
That's true. He not only did that, but he also was a correspondent too for the newspapers as well. So he brought home the images of the Australian in the First World War, and he was Australia's first official war artist. And following him, of course, other artists from the Victorian Artists'Society, such as John Longstaff, Arthur Street, and Harold Septimus Power, of course, became official war artists as well.
There seemed to be a lot of activity here in the Artists' Society itself during the war. It sort of became a little bit of a hub for the community to meet, and lots of things were done to aid the soldiers.
Yeah, I think this was generated by the fact that a lot of the artists either themselves had joined the war effort, or their children had been part of the war effort, or in case of Nellie Melba, she lost 5 members of her family in Gallipoli, and that made it very significant, to the war effort. The Crozier book, the Anzac book, was this one with his illustration of the wounded Anzac on the front cover, and that was just, as I said, that was the first book put out to actually talk about the Anzacs and the efforts that they made. The interesting thing with Crozier, of course, with the AIF and in the official documentation, I found this where he gives his place of residence as the Victorian Artists'Society.
So he actually decided he'd live here.
So he actually said he'd live here. Melba, of course, was very influential in helping organise the Australian Red Cross, and a lot of the concerts that she gave during the wartime were to raise money for the Red Cross, both here in Australia and in England, and overseas in the USA as well. She raised over £100,000 during that time for the war effort, so it was a tremendous effort that she put into it as well. Will Dyson, who had left Melbourne and gone overseas with his wife, and also at that time with Norman Lindsay, again was very influential and tremendously important, because he opened up the channels to war artists, although he didn't get paid, whereas later artists actually did get paid for their war effort.
I was reading a very interesting piece about some of the war artists from the Society, who actually are our best landscape artists that we know, the Streeton and Roberts and others, and it seemed that at one stage there they were engaged over in England helping to design camouflage.
They were. Camouflage was very important, and the interesting thing with camouflage is that the artists they looked for were quite often the ones who were suffering from colour blindness. Now the reason for this is it became more obvious because of what they, as colourblind artists, they could actually see things or see things and present things in a way which made it better for camouflage. And one of these artists was, of course, in later years, Harold Herbert, who was also a member here at the Victorian Artists' Society. But the artists such as Walter Withers, he died just as the war started, but he was very aware of what was going on in the war. And before he died, 3 years before 2 years before the war started, he painted a painting which we all know called The Drover. And this is significant because this is William Capewell in Eltham droving the sheep. Now the significance of this to the First World War is that William Capewell in September 1915 enlisted as a member of the remount unit, one of the remount soldiers heading off to Egypt to help look after the light horses that were sent over there. It's interesting, one of the untold stories of the First World War, quite often untold, is of course he left in November on the ship called the Sova, and one of the others on that ship was a gentleman who we all know and is on the $10 note, Banjo Paterson. Now Banjo Paterson, his story is tremendously important and certainly has links to the Victorian Artists' Society. He went over to the First World War with the remount unit as a captain. He had already served in France. He had also served in the Boer War, which not many people realise, and also in the Boxer Uprising. So he went over as looking after the horses and was given the job as a veterinary officer over there, and eventually became officer in charge of the remount units.
So in the First World War, obviously, there was a lot of activity here and also a lot of development of programs such as helping people who came back from the war and the soldiers who were injured. But then, of course, when you move to the Second World War, the Society has a very substantial connection there through Sir William Dargie.
It does, yes. And of course, Sir William Dargie spent time in New Guinea, painting and being a war artist in that area. Some of his works, of course, won the Archibald Prize for one of his works there, of one of the soldiers in the Second World War as well. I
think there's a very funny story about William Dargie being in a trench and someone had just come from Australia and he yelled out, "Oh, who won the Archibald Prize?" And the voice came back, "Oh, some bloke called Dargie," and he was down in the trench with the others.
It is an element of truth in that, in as much as, of course, he wasn't aware, and he was away at the time when the news came through. The interesting thing with Banjo Paterson and the links here was that, of course, he came back and he started working at the Bulletin in Sydney as a journalist, and of course Norman Lindsay, who was friends with him and wrote about Banjo Paterson as being a bohemian of the Bulletin. And they eventually sat down and put together a book together called, I've forgotten the name of it, put out a book called The Animals That Noah Forgot in 1933 with Banjo Paterson writing the book and Norman Lindsay illustrating it. But also John Longstaff, who was of course here, as I said, as a member, painted Banjo Paterson's portrait, and that won the 1935 Archibald Prize. So there's a nice link in that as well.
And Andrew, today, the artists that we have today at the Society, many of them continue with the Anzac theme, even the painting sitting behind you there on the wall. We've got an exhibition here which includes the paintings by some of our artists who are working here today of people who actually were in the war or were relatives of other members.
Yes, and and of course their relatives, of course, were within the war, and of course they themselves were involved in the Second World War effort as well.
Andrew MacKenzie, once again, thank you very much for filling us in and sharing with us your delightful amount of knowledge of the Victorian Artists'